Thank you for giving time for the interview. Let's start with the 2018. What do you think are the main challenges for the Myanmar peace process in 2018?
Yes. Well, first of all, at the end of this month, you have the next UPC. This, I think, is very important because there have been many questions asked about the speed and the effectiveness of the peace process, and in many quarters there has been a loss of confidence. So this offers an opportunity to re-establish and reinvigorate the process, particularly if there is an in-depth and progressive discussion of this question of federalism and the articulation of some principles that provide the basis for real work next year. So hopefully that will be an outcome of the UPC, and that will help provide the momentum to take us through this year. In addition, of course, you have on the one hand the peace process, but you also have different kinds of conflicts that fall outside the peace process in other parts of the country. So up in the northeast, you have a considerable amount of conflict at levels that are higher than in recent years, and clearly not something that the peace process per se is managing to address at the moment. So that's a great concern. The other concern, of course, is your northwestern border and the Rakhine crisis. Again, that falls outside the peace process that we're working on, but inevitably it affects the overall internal environment and, of course, the external perceptions of this country and of its peace process.
With your vast experience in the crisis areas in other parts of the world, how do you see Myanmar could handle these crises, particularly crises like Rakhine?
The experience I have had is quite varied, and peace processes are immensely different from one part of the world to the other. I'm quite often asked what lessons of best practice I can suggest from other countries. My impression, the older I get and the more experience I have, is that there are no best practices at all, though it is always important to try and see what other people did in other places, and particularly to talk to people who've been through the experience of peacemaking. What most of them will tell you, and I'm talking here about practitioners, people who have been negotiators, people who have been rebels, people who've been on the other side of the table, people who have come into positions of power after a peace agreement has been made. Most of what they can tell you that is valuable is about the mistakes they made, the things they wish they had not done. And most of those relate to fundamental human factors. I've seen peace processes as successful as the one in East Timor and as unsuccessful as the one between the Palestinians and the Israelis. In both cases, and in the cases of others I have seen also, many factors form the basis of the struggle and of the process of resolution. There are always profound historical factors. There are usually cultural and ethnic issues. There are always economic interests. These things are, in different ways, fundamentally present in all of these processes. The factor, however, that makes the difference is whether powerful individuals, those leaders who hold real power, actually wish to end the conflict or not. That may sound very simplistic, and perhaps it is, but that's certainly the common factor between peace processes that ultimately deliver and those that fail. Those leaders that have power, there may be several. There may be one significant and outstanding leader. There may be a number on each side. There may be many sides. But those who have power and have powerful followings have to really want to make peace and to resolve their differences. And normally what that means is that the most powerful among them have to give up stuff they don't want to give up, and they therefore have to persuade those who rely on them that the price is worth paying.
With Myanmar peace process, there are two sort of questions. One is the time frame.
Yes.
The Myanmar peace process can drag on. I mean, it has been for some years now. It can drag on for many more years. So what is a kind of a time frame that the crisis or the situation, the process in Myanmar can likely to take? That is one.
Yeah.
Second one is the progress. We had the previous government. Now we have a government led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy, which has been for more than 2 years in power. There is a question of how much progress has been made. So with these two questions, what do you think? Is Myanmar moving forward enough to see the light of, or to see the peace sooner or later?
Well, these questions of time frames are always difficult. One thing I've learned from my experience elsewhere is that when it appears that there is a real possibility of a peace process, you will find a wave of enthusiasm, both domestic and international, and extremely high expectations around the timetable. I remember my experience of this in the West Bank and Gaza in 1993, when the meeting between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat took place at the White House with President Clinton. Those of us involved, and that includes my Israeli colleagues who were deeply involved in the negotiations, felt that within a year we would be a decisive way towards peace. Now, of course, that process is still far from being concluded. It was an example, though, of how the desire of those involved in a peace process outruns their judgment about how realistic it is to get things done quickly. Some people say there is some sort of mathematical relationship between the length of the conflict and the length of the peace process. I'm not sure I buy that, but if you look at the Myanmar situation, this is a very long-running and therefore very complex series of conflicts. It's complex because there are so many actors, there have been so many stages, and the origins of what I would call the modern peace process in Myanmar go way back to just after the end of the Second War. I was here 2 years ago at the time when the JPF was set up. I paid a brief visit here. And I remember the enthusiasm and the excitement and the expectations about how quickly it might be possible to move towards a full settlement of these conflicts. It's easy now to look back and say, well, we were all far too optimistic. That's true. But at the same time, it's also easy to take the opposite position. In other words, having felt such high expectations, to actually feel extremely depressed and despairing about the process. A few years ago, in my last job in the World Bank, I was the director of one of these so-called World Development Reports, and this one was on conflict, security and development. And we looked at global conflict and global conflict trends. One of the major conclusions of the work was that psychological factors among leaders and followers are the real determinants of peace processes, not least because of what we call this cycle of expectations. As I said earlier, it's very common to have high expectations at the beginning of a promising process, but to lose those expectations to an excessive extent when things go wrong. And things always go wrong. Every peace process is marked by relapses, backsliding, mistakes, bad calculations, unexpected events. It's very difficult to actually tell, first of all, how long the process should take, and second, the difference between one's own depression and a failure of the process itself. So in this case, I think we're actually in a cycle of depression at the moment, but it would be premature to say that the peace process had failed. I think that would be a misjudgment and far too early a judgment. Now, having said that, there are many transitions occurring in Myanmar. First is a war to peace transition. This is the one that we work on in the JPF. Second is an economic transformation. The country is emerging from isolation and moving towards the kind of economic potential that this country has and deserves and should have achieved many years ago. Third, though, you have a democratic transition where you have a civilian government in this uneasy balance between a military establishment and the emergence of democracy. That is leading towards an election in 2020. That election puts pressure on this peace process. It means that there is a danger that the peace process can become instrumentalized in a conflict between the democratic process and the vestiges of the past. Therefore, there is a need to progress quickly with the peace process so that it doesn't get in some sense submerged or left behind in the preparations to the 2020 election. And for that reason, 2018 is very important for the peace process itself.